It was the most expensive refusal in the history of the Vietnam War. In September 1967, a senior American battalion commander stood inside a sandbagged command post at Fire Support Base Lorraine, 40 kilometers northwest of Nui Dat, and threw a field telephone against the wall. He had just been told that Australian reinforcements were being dispatched to support his position. His response crackled across 3 radio nets and was recorded by a signals intelligence team at Long Bin. "Don't send me those animals. I need real soldiers, not Boy Scouts playing dress-up in the jungle." He slammed his fist on the map table. He wanted American reinforcements, American helicopters, American artillery, American firepower. He wanted 200 men, a battery of 105s, and Cobra gunships. Instead, he was getting 12 Australians with cut-down rifles and sandals made from car tires. He didn't know it yet, but those 12 men were about to save every life in his perimeter, and within 72 hours, this same officer would be standing in the ruins of his own tactical assumptions, surrounded by evidence that everything he believed about warfare was wrong. But to understand why he refused them, and what happened after he did, we need to go back further. Back to a fundamental collision between 2 military philosophies that would define the entire war. Back to the moment when America and Australia looked at the same jungle and saw 2 completely different enemies. In 1962, the United States Secretary of State Dean Rusk made a remarkable admission at an ANZUS meeting in Canberra. He freely acknowledged that the American armed forces knew very little about jungle warfare. It was an extraordinary confession from the representative of the most powerful military on the planet. The Americans had defeated Nazi Germany. They had fought the Imperial Japanese across the Pacific. They had held the line in Korea against Chinese human wave assaults, but the dense, triple-canopy jungles of Southeast Asia presented a problem that sheer industrial might could not solve, and Dean Rusk knew it. The Australians, by contrast, had been fighting in jungles for over 2 decades. Their education had begun in the worst possible classroom. When Singapore fell in February 1942, the Australian Army received a lesson in jungle combat so brutal it permanently altered their institutional DNA. The Japanese had swept down the Malayan Peninsula with a speed and ferocity that exposed every weakness in Commonwealth defensive doctrine. Australian soldiers, trained for the open deserts of North Africa, found themselves fighting an enemy who moved through the jungle like water through a sieve. They were outflanked, outmaneuvered, and outfought. Thousands were captured. Thousands more died. The survivors never forgot. What followed was one of the most painful military adaptations in modern history. On the Kokoda Track in Papua New Guinea, Australian soldiers learned to fight in the jungle through trial and attrition. They improvised. They dyed their pale desert uniforms with coffee. They abandoned standard tactics and copied the Japanese methods of infiltration and ambush. They traded their regulation kit for whatever worked, and slowly, agonizingly, they began to win. Not with firepower, not with technology, but with adaptation, patience, and an intimate understanding of the terrain. This knowledge did not evaporate when the war ended. The Australian Army preserved it, refined it, and tested it again during the Malayan Emergency, a 12-year counterinsurgency campaign that lasted from 1948 to 1960. In the jungles of Malaya, Australian infantry battalions spent years hunting communist guerrillas of the Malayan National Liberation Army, who operated in small groups, avoided set-piece battles, and relied on the jungle itself as their greatest weapon. The 2nd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, arrived in Penang in 1955 and spent months patrolling through rubber plantations and dense primary jungle, learning lessons about tracking, ambush craft, and the terrible patience required to find an enemy who did not want to be found. When the 3rd Battalion replaced them in 1957, the cycle continued, each rotation of troops absorbing new knowledge and carrying it back to Australia. The British had established a jungle warfare school in Malaya that developed optimal tactics based on field experience, and the Australians absorbed every lesson it had to offer. By the time the emergency officially ended in 1960, the Australian Army had been fighting guerrillas in tropical jungle for the better part of a decade. The parallels with what would come in Vietnam were almost exact. But Malaya was not the only proving ground. From 1963 to 1966, Australian SAS squadrons deployed to Borneo during the Indonesian confrontation, conducting covert cross-border reconnaissance operations in jungle so dense that visibility rarely exceeded 3 meters. These operations were conducted in absolute secrecy. The Australian government denied they were happening at all. SAS patrols crossed into Indonesian territory, gathered intelligence on enemy troop concentrations, and withdrew without detection. The skills developed during these missions, silent movement through impenetrable vegetation, the ability to remain concealed for days at a time, within arm's reach of enemy positions, the psychological resilience required to operate deep behind enemy lines with no possibility of rescue, would translate directly to the jungles of Vietnam. At the Jungle Training Center in Canungra, Queensland, the Australian Army codified all of this hard-won knowledge into a training regime so demanding that many candidates did not complete it. The commandant from 1955 to 1957 was Colonel Francis Ted Sarong, who would later lead the 1st Australian Advisory Team to Vietnam. The instructors were drawn from men with combat experience in the Pacific, Malaya, and later Borneo during the Indonesian confrontation. They taught patrolling techniques refined over 3 wars. They taught ambush and counter-ambush drills that had been tested against enemies who lived in the jungle permanently. They taught that patience was more lethal than ammunition. When the 1st Australian combat units arrived in Vietnam in 1965, they brought all of this with them. The 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, was deployed alongside the U.S. 173rd Airborne Brigade in Bien Hoa Province. It was here, operating side by side with American soldiers for the first time, that the fundamental differences between the two armies became impossible to ignore. The Americans measured progress in body counts. The Australians measured it in intelligence gathered, population secured, and enemy capability degraded. The Americans launched massive search and destroy operations, deploying battalions and brigades in sweeps designed to flush out the enemy and destroy him with overwhelming firepower. The Australians operated in smaller units, moved more slowly, set more ambushes, and made less noise. The Americans used defoliants to strip the jungle bare. The Australians learned to move through it without disturbing a single vine. These differences were not merely tactical preferences. They reflected fundamentally different understandings of what kind of war was being fought. The Americans believed they were fighting a conventional enemy who could be ground down through attrition, the same logic that had worked against Germany and Japan. The Australians believed they were fighting an insurgency that could only be defeated by separating the guerrilla from the population, by out-patrolling the enemy, outweighting him, and making his own territory unsafe for him to operate in. General William Westmoreland, the commander of all American forces in Vietnam, made his position on the matter clear. During a visit to the 1st Australian Task Force in January 1967, he complained directly to Major General Tim Vincent, the commander of Australian Forces Vietnam, that the Australians were being very inactive. Westmoreland wanted aggression. He wanted big operations, large formations, visible results that could be briefed to Washington and presented to the press. The Australian approach of slow, deliberate patrolling, of cordon and search operations, of methodical intelligence collection, looked to him like timidity. The Australians disagreed, and they had the results to prove it. But institutional friction between the two allies was now a permanent feature of the war. It colored every interaction, every joint operation, every request for coordination, and it created the conditions for the disaster that would unfold at Fire Support Base Lorraine. The 1st Australian Task Force had established itself at Nui Dat, in the heart of Phuoc Tuy Province, in May 1966. The location was deliberate and revealing. Nui Dat sat in the middle of what was effectively Viet Cong territory. The province had been under communist influence for years. The South Vietnamese government's authority extended little beyond the provincial capital of Ba Ria and the port city of Vung Tau. In the countryside, the Viet Cong had built an extensive political and military infrastructure that reached into virtually every village and hamlet. Military estimates placed the number of communist troops in the province at about 5,000, supported by an intricate network of cells and committees known as the Viet Cong infrastructure that extended political control into the most remote settlements. The roads were dangerous, subject to ambush, and passable only with heavy military escort. The Viet Cong had established bases in the mountains and jungles that ringed the province, particularly in the Long Hai Hills to the south and the Mae Tao Mountains to the northeast. The D-445 Provincial Mobile Battalion, a seasoned enemy formation with deep roots in the local population, operated throughout the province with apparent impunity. The Australians chose this location precisely because it was dangerous. They placed themselves directly in the enemy's living room, then began the slow, methodical work of pushing him out. The task force commander, Brigadier Oliver David Jackson, made decisions that were tactically sound but politically costly. The villages nearest Nui Dat, Long Tan, and Long Phuoc were both considered Viet Cong strongholds, and their populations were forcibly resettled to deny the enemy intelligence about the new Australian base. It was a harsh measure that damaged the effort to win local support, but it reflected the brutal calculus of counterinsurgency warfare. Within weeks, the Australians had established a pattern of aggressive patrolling that would define their operations for the next 5 years. Infantry companies pushed out from Nui Dat in deliberate sweeps, setting ambushes along suspected Viet Cong routes, searching villages without destroying them, and gradually extending the arc of government control. The SAS operated beyond this perimeter, ranging deep into enemy territory on missions that lasted for weeks. Their Special Air Service Regiment, the SAS, served as the task force's primary intelligence gathering tool, conducting long-range reconnaissance patrols that penetrated deep into enemy-held territory. The SAS squadrons rotated through Vietnam on yearly deployments, never numbering more than about 150 men in country at any given time. But their impact was vastly disproportionate to their numbers. Between 1966 and 1971, Australian SAS conducted approximately 1,200 combat patrols. Their casualty figures were remarkable. Only one OAS soldier was killed in action. One died of wounds. 3 were killed accidentally. 1 remained missing. 28 were wounded. Against these losses, the regiment accounted for approximately 600 enemy killed, the highest kill ratio of any Australian unit in the war, and by some measures, the highest of any Allied unit operating in Vietnam. These numbers did not arrive by accident. They were the product of a patrol methodology so refined, so disciplined, and so psychologically demanding that American observers who witnessed it often struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. Australian SAS patrols typically consisted of 5 men. 5. In a war where the Americans operated in platoon and company strength, the Australians sent half a squad into enemy-controlled territory for periods of up to 3 weeks. The patrols moved with a slowness that American officers found almost physically painful to watch. Where American long-range reconnaissance teams covered 2 to 3 kilometers per day, Australian SAS patrols might cover only a few hundred meters in the same period. The point man would take a single step, placing his foot with absolute precision to avoid any sound or visible disturbance. Then the entire patrol would freeze, not for seconds, for minutes. They would remain completely motionless, scanning their environment with their eyes, reading the sounds of the jungle, testing the air for any scent that did not belong. Only when every man in the patrol was satisfied that no threat existed would the next step be taken. This glacial pace achieved something that speed could not. It made the Australians invisible. At 2 or 3 kilometers per day, an American patrol created a constant stream of disturbances, snapping twigs, rustling vegetation, compressing soil. Viet Cong listening posts were specifically trained to detect these signatures. But at the Australian pace, the jungle's natural soundscape recovered completely between movements. Birds continued to sing. Insects continued to drone. To an enemy scout, an area where Australians were operating sounded perfectly normal. There was nothing to investigate, nothing to report, nothing to ambush. The Australians enhanced this concealment through a series of adaptations that went far beyond tactical technique. They eliminated every chemical signature that might betray their presence. Weeks before a patrol, SAS troopers stopped using soap, deodorant, shaving cream, and commercial toothpaste. They switched from Western cigarettes to local tobacco or stopped smoking entirely. They ate local food. By the time they were inserted into the jungle, they smelled like the environment itself. They wore footwear designed to leave no recognizable tracks, sometimes using sandals modeled on the type worn by Viet Cong fighters, sometimes wrapping their boots in cloth or rubber cut to obscure their tread pattern. When crossing soft ground, the last man in the patrol would brush out tracks with branches. They walked in streams when possible. They stepped on roots and rocks rather than bare earth. The Viet Cong, who had tracked French colonial forces for years, who tracked South Vietnamese Army units with ease, and who tracked American patrols almost at will, found that they simply could not follow the Australians. They modified their weapons, shortening the barrels of their rifles to eliminate the constant snagging on vegetation that longer-barreled weapons suffered in dense jungle. The standard L1A1 self-loading rifle, a variant of the legendary FNF-AL, was accurate to 400 meters. But in Vietnamese jungle, where visibility rarely exceeded 10 to 15 meters, that range was irrelevant. The Australians traded long-range precision for close-quarters maneuverability. The resulting weapon was louder and less accurate at distance, but it slid through undergrowth without catching, and the heavy 7.62 millimeter round It delivered devastating stopping power at the ranges where jungle fights actually happened. All of this produced results that American intelligence analysts found difficult to process. And it was this gap in understanding, this gulf between what the Americans believed about warfare and what the Australians were actually doing, that made the events at Fire Support Base Lorraine inevitable. The operation that led to Lorraine began in late August 1967, when American intelligence identified increased enemy movement in the border region between Phuoc Tuy and Long Con provinces. A Viet Cong regiment, elements of the 274th, had been detected moving south from War Zone D toward the populated areas of the coast. The American response was characteristically aggressive. A battalion from the 173rd Airborne Brigade was tasked with establishing a fire support base along the suspected route of advance, blocking the enemy's movement and forcing him into a set-piece engagement where American firepower could be brought to bear. The battalion commander selected for this mission was a lieutenant colonel on his second Vietnam tour. A West Point graduate with experience in Korea, he had earned a reputation for aggressive leadership and unshakable confidence in American methods. He had fought alongside Australian units during the early phase of the first Australian Task Force's deployment and had come away unimpressed. He found their pace of operations too slow, their unit sizes too small, their aversion to large-scale engagements philosophically incompatible with winning the war. When his battalion airlifted into Fire Support Base Lorraine on the morning of September 14th, he had approximately 400 men, a battery of 6 105mm howitzers, and the promise of helicopter gunship support on call. By any American standard, this was a formidable force. His soldiers were veterans. His artillery was registered on every likely approach. His defensive perimeter was textbook. What he did not have was accurate intelligence about what was waiting for him in the surrounding jungle. An Australian SAS patrol had been operating in the area for 8 days. 4 men, moving at their standard glacial pace, had been gathering intelligence on enemy dispositions throughout the region. They had identified not 1, but 2 Viet Cong battalions, the leading elements of the 274th Regiment, moving through a series of staging areas less than 3 kilometers from where Lorraine was being established. They had documented ammunition caches, observed command meetings, counted weapons, and mapped the trail networks the enemy was using. This intelligence had been reported through Australian channels. Whether it reached American planners before the operation launched remains a matter of dispute. What is certain is that the battalion commander at Lorraine was operating without it. He knew the enemy was in the area. He did not know the enemy was essentially surrounding him. On the morning of September 16th, the Australian SAS patrol leader made direct contact with the American command post at Lorraine. He reported the enemy dispositions he had observed and offered to coordinate with the American force. The American battalion commander's response was received by every radio operator on the Australian net. He didn't want Australians. He didn't need Australians. He had a full American battalion with artillery and air support. What could 12 men possibly contribute that 400 couldn't handle? The phrase that would become infamous across 2 Allied armies came next. He called them animals, not soldiers, animals. The Australian SAS patrol leader acknowledged the refusal and reported it up his chain of command. Australian Task Force headquarters received the information and made a decision that would prove critical. They did not withdraw the patrol. Instead, they reinforced it, inserting an additional 8 men by foot from a position 7 kilometers to the south. The Australians would remain in the area regardless of the American commander's wishes, operating independently under their own authority. The attack came at 03:47 hours on September 17th. The Viet Cong had spent 2 days studying the American perimeter, mapping the positions of the artillery pieces, identifying the machine gun emplacements, locating the command post. They attacked from 3 directions simultaneously, concentrating their initial assault on the northeast corner of the perimeter where a gap in the wire had been created by a drainage channel. The first mortar rounds landed on the artillery positions. The Viet Cong had pre-registered their fire with a precision that suggested they had observed the base being constructed and had plotted every significant target. Within the first 3 minutes, 2 of the 6 howitzers were knocked out. The ammunition supply point took a direct hit, sending secondary explosions cascading across the base. The infantry assault followed immediately. Viet Cong sappers had crawled to within 30 meters of the wire during the night, using the classic patience that had made them masters of the approach. They breached the perimeter at 3 points within the first 10 minutes. The fighting became hand-to-hand in places. The American soldiers fought with the desperate courage of men defending their own ground, but the initial shock of the assault had disrupted their command structure. Radio antennas were down. The Tactical Operations Center had taken a direct hit. The battalion commander was wounded in the first exchange. By 04:30 hours, the situation was critical. The Americans had lost a significant portion of their perimeter. Casualties were mounting. The surviving artillery pieces were firing over open sights at point-blank range. Air support had been requested, but would not arrive until dawn. The American battalion was fighting for survival. At 04:12 hours, the deputy commander made a radio call that would have been unthinkable 24 hours earlier. He requested Australian assistance. He would take anyone, anything, immediately. The Australian SAS patrol had been monitoring the battle from a concealed position 800 meters northeast of Lorraine. They had listened to the enemy's final preparations in the hours before the assault. They had counted the mortar positions. They had mapped the enemy's command post. They had identified the routes being used to funnel reinforcements into the attack. They had reported all of this through their own channels, but the information had not been requested and had not been acted upon. Now they moved. The Australians did not charge toward the sound of the guns. They did not sprint to the rescue. They did what they had been trained to do. They began calling artillery corrections. From their concealed position inside the enemy's own tactical area, the Australian patrol leader began transmitting precise coordinates to Australian artillery at Nui Dat, 40 kilometers away. These were not the broad area suppression missions the Americans had been calling. These were surgical strikes directed by men who could actually see the targets. The first mission landed directly on the Viet Cong mortar line that had been systematically destroying the American artillery. The mortars went silent. The second mission hit the enemy command post, killing or wounding the officers directing the assault. The third sealed the reinforcement route that had been funneling fresh fighters into the breach in the American wire. Within 40 minutes, the character of the battle changed completely. The assault that had been methodically overwhelming the American position began to falter. Enemy fighters who had been receiving clear orders suddenly found themselves without direction. Reinforcements that had been arriving in a steady stream were cut off. Mortar support that had been suppressing the American defensive positions was eliminated. The Australians did not stop there. As dawn broke and the enemy began withdrawing, the SAS patrol tracked the retreat, calling further artillery missions onto withdrawal routes and rally points. What had begun as a coordinated regimental assault dissolved into a disorganized rout. Viet Cong fighters, who attempted to regroup at predetermined rally points, found those points already under fire. Officers attempting to establish new command posts found themselves targeted with a precision that seemed impossible. By 700 hours, it was over. The Americans held Lorraine, but the cost had been severe. Dozens of American soldiers were dead, many more were wounded. The Fire Support Base was wrecked, its artillery damaged, its perimeter scarred by breaches that had come within minutes of becoming fatal. The Viet Cong losses were significantly heavier. The body count, that grim metric the Americans used to measure success, was substantial. But more importantly, the 274th Regiment's offensive capability had been shattered in a single night, not by American firepower, which had been largely neutralized in the opening minutes, but by 12 Australians with radios and an intimate knowledge of how to find and destroy targets in the dark. The aftermath of Lorraine produced a series of classified reports that told different stories depending on who wrote them. The American After-Action Review emphasized the valor of the defending battalion, the effectiveness of the defensive perimeter once the initial shock was absorbed, and the timely arrival of air support at dawn. The Australian role was mentioned in a single paragraph. The Australian reports were more detailed and considerably more pointed. They documented the intelligence warnings that had been provided and ignored. They recorded the refusal of coordination. They catalogued the artillery corrections that had turned the battle. They noted, with the precise understatement that characterized Australian military writing, that the outcome might have been different had coordination been accepted when first offered. But the most revealing document came from neither army. It came from the enemy. Captured Viet Cong documents from the period revealed that the 274th Regiment's after-action assessment attributed its failure not to American resistance, which had been expected and planned for, but to the unexplained artillery fire that had struck with impossible accuracy during the critical phase of the assault. The enemy analysts could not understand how their mortar positions, which had been carefully concealed and which the Americans could not possibly have seen, had been destroyed within minutes. They could not explain how their command post, located 400 meters behind the assault line in dense jungle, had been targeted with what appeared to be direct observation. They could not account for the precise interdiction of reinforcement routes that they believed were unknown to the enemy. Their conclusion was that the Americans must have deployed some new form of electronic surveillance technology capable of detecting positions in the dark. They were wrong. It was not technology. It was 12 men who smelled like the jungle, moved like shadows, and had been watching them for 8 days. The disparity between what American technology could achieve and what Australian fieldcraft accomplished was one of the great unacknowledged truths of the Vietnam War. The United States poured billions of dollars into electronic surveillance systems. Operation Igloo White seeded the Ho Chi Minh Trail with thousands of acoustic and seismic sensors designed to detect enemy movement. Infrared detection equipment was mounted on aircraft. Starlight scopes that amplified ambient light were distributed to frontline units. And yet, for all this technological investment, the fundamental problem remained. Sensors could detect movement. They could not distinguish between a Viet Cong battalion moving to attack and a herd of water buffalo moving to feed. They generated enormous quantities of data, but often failed to produce actionable intelligence. The Australians solved this problem the oldest way possible. They put human beings into the enemy's operating area and kept them there long enough to understand what was happening. A 5-man patrol that had spent a week observing enemy movement could provide intelligence of a quality and specificity that no electronic sensor could match. They could identify unit commanders. They could count weapons. They could observe the state of enemy morale, the quality of their equipment, the efficiency of their logistics. They could distinguish between a main force battalion preparing an attack and a local guerrilla unit moving supplies. This was intelligence that could be acted upon with confidence, and at Lorraine it was this intelligence that turned a potential disaster into a tactical victory. The lieutenant colonel who had refused the Australians survived his wounds. He was evacuated to the hospital at Long Bin and then to Japan. He never returned to Vietnam. His career did not end at Lorraine, but it never fully recovered either. The classified reports followed him, and while the institutional machinery of the Army protected him from formal censure, the word spread through the officer corps in the way that such things always do. Years later, in a private conversation recorded by an Army historian collecting oral testimonies from Vietnam veterans, the officer reflected on that night. He admitted that his refusal had been rooted not in tactical judgment, but in prejudice. He had looked at the Australians and seen a small, poorly equipped force from a country he considered militarily insignificant. He had seen their modified weapons and unconventional appearance, and concluded that they could not possibly offer anything of value to a full American battalion. He had been catastrophically wrong, and he knew it. The 12 men he had called animals had saved his command from potential annihilation. They had accomplished with radios and patience what his 400 men with artillery and air support had failed to achieve. They had found the enemy, fixed him, and destroyed his ability to fight, not with overwhelming force, but with precise, patient, intelligence-driven action. They had done it without losing a single man. They had done it without firing a single shot. They had used the one weapon the Americans had never learned to deploy effectively in Vietnam: knowledge. Knowledge of where the enemy was, what he was doing, and how to destroy him with maximum efficiency and minimum exposure. This was the lesson the American military establishment was slowest to learn. Not that the Australians had better soldiers or braver men. The Americans who fought at Lorraine had shown courage that no one could question. The lesson was that courage without intelligence is merely sacrifice, and firepower without precision is merely noise. The Australians understood that the jungle rewarded those who listened more than those who shouted. That patience was a weapon more lethal than any howitzer. That 5 men who knew where the enemy was could accomplish more than 500 who did not. The friction between American and Australian methods was not confined to Lorraine. It ran through the entire war like a fault line, occasionally producing tremors that shook both commands. The fundamental disagreement was philosophical. The Americans believed in speed, mass, and firepower. Their doctrine had been forged in the furnace of the Second World War, where industrial output and overwhelming force had crushed the Axis powers. In Korea, the same principles had held the line against Chinese armies, numbering in the hundreds of thousands. These were not abstract theories. They were battle-tested truths that had saved civilization. To suggest they might not work in Vietnam was, for many American officers, almost heretical. The Australians came from a different tradition entirely. Their military experience had been shaped by small wars, colonial policing actions, and counterinsurgencies, where the enemy could not be overwhelmed because there simply was not enough force available to overwhelm him with. In Malaya, they had spent 12 years fighting an insurgency that taught them patience was more valuable than ammunition. In Borneo during the Indonesian confrontation, they had conducted covert cross-border operations where stealth was not just preferred, but essential for survival. Colonel David Hackworth, one of the most decorated and controversial American officers of the Vietnam era, recognized what the Australians were doing. Hackworth had arrived in Vietnam with the 101st Airborne Division in 1965 and quickly concluded that American tactics were catastrophically unsuited to the environment. He described the standard American approach with withering contempt, noting that 2 years into a jungle-oriented war, all of the Army's schools were still teaching tactics designed for European battlefields. He saw colleagues dying because they were employing methods designed for the open plains of Germany in the triple canopy jungles of Southeast Asia. Hackworth transformed underperforming units by adopting guerrilla methods, training his men to fight in small groups, to move at night, to use ambush rather than frontal assault. When he took command of the demoralized 4th Battalion, 39th Infantry Regiment in the Mekong Delta, a unit that had lost 600 men in 6 months, he retrained them from scratch. He broke them into small elements and taught them to operate like the enemy. Within weeks, the battalion's performance reversed. In the next 6 months, they lost 25 men and accounted for over 2,600 Viet Cong. His methods, which mirrored Australian practice in many essential respects, produced results that shamed conventional units operating in the same area. General Creighton Abrams, who succeeded Westmoreland as commander of all American forces in Vietnam, called Hackworth the best battalion commander he had ever seen in the United States Army. But Hackworth was a rebel, and the American military system did not reward rebels. When he went on national television in 1971 and declared that Vietnam was a bad war that could not be won, his career was finished. He retired and moved to Australia, settling on the Gold Coast. The irony was not lost on those who followed his story. The American officer who had most successfully adapted to jungle warfare chose to live in the country whose army had been doing it right all along. After the war, Hackworth would write extensively about the failures of American doctrine in Vietnam. He noted that the American military had been designed to fight on European battlefields with massed formations, coordinated firepower, and clear front lines. Vietnam had no front lines. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. The jungle negated most of the technological advantages that American forces possessed. Radar could not see through triple canopy. Helicopters could not hover over targets they could not find. Artillery could not hit positions that had not been located. And the standard American method of locating the enemy, sending large, noisy formations through the jungle until someone started shooting, ensured that the Viet Cong always chose the terms of engagement. The Australians had inverted every one of these assumptions: small units instead of large ones, stealth instead of speed, intelligence before firepower, patience before aggression. And the results spoke in a language that even the most resistant institutional mind could not ignore. The Australian SAS achieved kill ratios that made American units look inefficient by comparison. Australian infantry battalions in Phuoc Tuy Province conducted a counterinsurgency campaign that progressively weakened Viet Cong capability across the entire province. By 1969, after years of sustained Australian operations, the bulk of enemy forces had been pushed out of the province or rendered inactive, Yet the recognition came slowly, when it came at all. The Australians had proven their worth in the most dramatic fashion possible just weeks after arriving in Puuaktoi. On August 18, 1966, D Company of the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 108 men, found themselves facing an estimated 2,000 Viet Cong in a rubber plantation near the village of Long Tan. Pinned down, low on ammunition, and in danger of being completely overrun, the Australians held their position for 4 hours in the middle of a tropical downpour, supported by artillery fire so accurate it landed within meters of their own positions. They were eventually reinforced by armored personnel carriers that had to swim across a flooded creek and fight through enemy positions to reach them. When the Viet Cong withdrew at nightfall, they left behind 245 dead. 18 Australians had been killed, with 25 wounded. It was a victory, won not through overwhelming force but through discipline, firepower coordination, and the willingness to hold ground that any reasonable calculation said should have been abandoned. The Battle of Long Tan should have been the moment when American observers sat up and paid serious attention to Australian methods. Here was proof that small, well-trained units could defeat numerically superior forces through superior tactics and fire discipline. But the lesson was absorbed unevenly. Some American officers recognized its significance. Others dismissed it as an isolated incident, a lucky engagement that proved nothing about the broader war. Westmoreland, despite his criticism of Australian pace, eventually acknowledged their professionalism. In his memoir, he called the Australians the most thoroughly professional foreign force serving in Vietnam, and compared them to the post-Versailles German army, in which even men in the ranks might have been leaders in a less capable force. It was a generous assessment, but it came after the damage had been done. The institutional resistance to learning from allies had cost years and lives. The legacy of what happened between American and Australian forces in Vietnam extends far beyond the battlefields of Phuoc Tuy Province. When the United States military finally undertook a serious reform of its special operations capabilities in the 1980s, the reforms incorporated principles that the Australians had demonstrated effective 2 decades earlier. The emphasis on small unit tactics, the prioritization of intelligence over firepower, the understanding that cultural adaptation and environmental integration could achieve results that technology alone could not deliver. Delta Force, the expanded SEAL teams, the entire modern apparatus of American unconventional warfare, all carry the DNA of lessons that were available for learning in the jungles of South Vietnam in 1966. The methods were there, the evidence was overwhelming. The Australians were willing to teach. The institutions were simply not willing to learn. But there is another dimension to this story that straightforward tactical analysis tends to overlook. The methods that made the Australians so devastatingly effective carried costs measured in currencies that no after-action report could capture. The men who learned to become invisible in the jungle, who trained themselves to suppress every human impulse, who spent weeks in a state of hyper-awareness so intense it bordered on the predatory, did not simply switch off these adaptations when they came home. Over 60,000 Australians served in Vietnam between 1962 and 1972. Of the 523 who died, many more were wounded in body and mind. Post-traumatic stress rates among Australian Vietnam veterans would eventually be staggering, in some measures exceeding those of their American counterparts, despite the smaller numbers involved and the lower overall casualty rates. the very transformation that made them effective operators, the ability to suppress emotion, to exist in a state of constant threat assessment, to process every human interaction as a potential danger, made reintegration into civilian life extraordinarily difficult. The Australian government was slow to acknowledge this cost. Veterans returned to a society increasingly hostile to the war itself, and the men who had served with such quiet professionalism found themselves treated as pariahs by a public that could not distinguish between the war and the warriors. The Welcome Home Parade that should have honored their service did not take place until 1987, 15 years after the last combat troops departed. By then, many veterans had already been destroyed by the war they had fought so effectively. This was the price of the methodology that American observers found so impressive. The survival rates proved it worked beyond any possibility of dispute, but survival was not the same as returning whole. Coming home alive was not the same as coming home unchanged. The officer who refused Australian reinforcements at Lorraine represents something larger than one man's misjudgment. He represents the institutional arrogance that cost the American military dearly throughout the Vietnam War, the unshakable belief that the American way was the only way, that bigger was always better, that technology would always trump technique, that the army that had defeated Hitler could not possibly learn anything from a country most Americans could not find on a map. The 12 Australians who saved his command that night did not seek recognition. They did not file complaints about the insult they had received. They did what they had been trained to do. They found the enemy. They watched him. They waited. And when the moment came, they struck with a precision that rewrote the outcome of a battle that should have been lost. One refusal, one night, one lesson that took decades to learn and may never have been fully absorbed. The Americans at Lorraine fought with extraordinary courage. No one who was there would deny that. But courage is not doctrine. Bravery is not strategy. And the most powerful military on earth spent years learning what 12 men with sawed-off rifles and tire rubber sandals already knew. The jungle does not care how many stars are on your collar. It does not care how many helicopters are on your flight line. It does not care about your artillery batteries or your air support or your satellite communications. The jungle cares about one thing only. Whether you understand it, the Australians understood it, and that understanding saved the lives of men who had called them animals. That is the arithmetic of humility. That is the mathematics of listening. That is the calculus of accepting that your allies might know something you do not. 50 years later, the lesson still echoes through every military classroom, every doctrine manual, every after-action report where the words coalition coordination appear. Work with your allies. Listen to their experience. Accept their help when it is offered, because the next time someone calls them animals, it might be the animals who save your life. The modern Special Operations Forces that carry the legacy of both American and Australian Vietnam-era innovators understand this now. At Fort Liberty, formerly Fort Bragg, and at the Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado, instructors teach patrol methods that would be instantly recognizable to the Australian SAS troopers who pioneered them in Vuoc Tui Province over half a century ago. The emphasis on small unit operations, on intelligence-driven targeting, on cultural adaptation and environmental mastery, all of these principles were proven in the jungles of South Vietnam by men who were dismissed as primitives by the very forces they would eventually rescue. the Australian commitment to Vietnam has largely faded from the popular memory of the war, overshadowed by the vastly larger American involvement. Most histories of Vietnam, written by Americans for American audiences, barely mention the Australian presence. Yet, in the classified archives, in the after-action reports that were stamped and buried because they embarrassed powerful institutions, in the enemy documents that revealed the Viet Cong feared the Australians more than any other Allied force, the record is clear. Approximately 60,000 Australians served in Vietnam between 1962 and 1972. Of these, 523 died and nearly 2,400 were wounded. They fought with a professionalism and an effectiveness that their allies were often too proud to acknowledge, and their enemies were too afraid to confront directly. They developed methods of jungle warfare so sophisticated that the most powerful military on Earth spent decades catching up to what they had demonstrated in the field. And on one night in September 1967, at a fire support base called Lorraine, 12 of them proved that the measure of a soldier is not the size of his unit or the weight of his firepower. It is his understanding of the ground he fights on, his knowledge of the enemy he faces, and his willingness to do whatever the mission requires, even when the people he is trying to save have called him an animal. That is the legacy of the Australian soldier in Vietnam. Not the machines of war, not the helicopters, or the artillery, or the napalm, just men in the jungle doing what needed to be done, quietly, patiently, invisibly, and when it mattered most, decisively. One refusal, one rescue, one lesson the whole world should have learned. The animals turned out to be the hunters, and the hunters saved the men who mocked them.